They say a man's truest words are the ones he never speaks aloud. King Alaric of Alderneth had ruled for 41 years, and in all that time, the court believed they knew exactly where his heart lay. They were wrong. Locked inside a drawer that only he had the key to, sealed with wax the color of old blood, lay a single letter that would unmake every assumption the palace had ever held. And the name written inside it was not the one anyone expected. It was the name of a woman they had spent 20 years pretending not to see. If you have ever been underestimated, dismissed, or told to know your place, stay with this story until the end. Because what King Alaric did from beyond the grave is the kind of justice most of us only dream about. The rain came sideways across the courtyards of Alderneth Castle the morning the old king died. It had been raining for 3 days, as though the sky itself had known before anyone else did. In the great stone corridors, servants moved with their heads bowed and their voices low, and the tall windows wept long streaks down the glass. King Alaric had been ill for the better part of a year, and everyone had prepared themselves for this day. Or so they thought. What none of them had prepared for was what came after. In the West Wing, in a small sitting room far from the grand state chambers, a woman named Eleanor sat very still by the fire. She was 43 years old, though the last 2 decades had taught her to feel much older. Her hands were folded in her lap, and her eyes were fixed on the flames, and she did not weep the loud performative tears that echoed down from the staterooms above. Her grief was quieter than that. It belonged to her alone. Eleanor had married into the royal house of Alderneth 22 years earlier, and from the very first day she had been treated as an intruder. She had not come from a great family. Her father had been a country physician, respected in his own small town but utterly without title or land. When Prince Edmund, the king's only son, had fallen in love with her and announced his intention to marry, the court had reacted as though he had proposed to bring a stray dog to sit at the high table. They had not said so openly, of course. The nobility of Alderneth were far too refined for open cruelty. Their weapons were subtler. The slight pause before a greeting, the seat placed just a little too far from the center, the invitation that arrived a day too late, the conversation that fell silent when she entered a room. For 22 years, Eleanor had lived inside a fortress of polite contempt, and she had endured it with a grace that only made her enemies despise her more. The chief among those enemies was the Dowager Countess Margaret, the king's own sister. Margaret was a tall, narrow woman with a face like a closed door and a memory that never forgave a single slight. From the beginning she had decided that Eleanor was beneath the family, and no act of kindness, no gesture of loyalty, no quiet years of devotion had ever softened that judgment. To Margaret, Eleanor would always be the physician's daughter who had tricked a prince into forgetting his duty. And then there was the matter of Edmund himself. Eleanor's husband, the prince, had died 4 years before his father. A riding accident on a cold autumn morning had taken him in an instant, and with him had gone the one person in the palace who had ever truly stood at Eleanor's side. After his death, the court had expected her to fade quietly into the background, perhaps to retire to some distant estate and trouble them no further. Instead, she had stayed. She had stayed because the old king had asked her to. That was the thing the court never understood. In the years after Edmund's death, a strange and unexpected friendship had grown between the grieving widow and the aging king. It happened slowly, in the way that real things do. King Alaric, who had lost his only son, found in Eleanor the one person in the palace who did not want something from him. She did not scheme for position. She did not whisper in his ear about titles and lands. She simply sat with him in the long evenings when the loneliness pressed hardest, and she listened, and she remembered his stories, and she treated him not as a king, but as a man who was frightened of dying alone. Margaret had watched this friendship grow with mounting alarm. She told herself, and anyone who would listen, that the widow was manipulating a vulnerable old man, working her way into his affections for some hidden purpose. She could not conceive of a kindness that asked for nothing in return, because she had never once offered such a kindness herself. Now the old king was dead, and the vultures were already circling. By midday the castle was full of them, cousins and nobles and distant relations who had barely visited in years, all of them arriving in black carriages with grave expressions and hungry eyes. The great question that hung over every hushed conversation was the same: what would become of the king's fortune? For King Alaric had been an extraordinarily wealthy man. Beyond the crown lands and the state treasury, which passed by law to the throne, he had accumulated over his long life a vast personal fortune, private estates, art collections, investments, jewels, and a country manor called Rosewood that he had loved above all his other properties. This private wealth was his to give as he chose, and everyone in that castle believed they knew where at least a portion of it should go: to themselves. Chief among the claimants was Margaret. As the king's sister and the senior surviving member of the family, she considered the private fortune all but hers by right. She had already, in the hours since the king's death, begun to speak of Rosewood as though it were settled, mentioning to the household staff which rooms she intended to redecorate, and which of the old king's paintings she found distasteful. Into this gathering storm walked a man named Master Corwin, the king's private notary. He was an old man himself, stooped and gray, and he had served King Alaric faithfully for nearly 40 years. He carried under his arm a locked wooden box, and behind his spectacles his eyes held something that none of the assembled nobles could quite read. The formal reading of the will was set for the following afternoon in the castle's great library. Word spread quickly, and by the appointed hour the long room was full. Margaret took the finest chair, positioned near the front, and arranged her black skirts around her with the confidence of a woman about to be confirmed in everything she believed she deserved. The lesser relations filled the rows behind her, and Eleanor, when she arrived, found that no chair had been left for her at all. She did not make a scene. She never did. She simply moved to the side of the room and stood quietly against the tall shelves of books, half in shadow, as though she expected nothing and had come only out of respect. A few heads turned to note her presence, and a few lips curled, and Margaret, catching sight of her, allowed herself a small, cold smile. "I did not realize," Margaret said, in a voice pitched to Carrie, "that the reading concerned the household staff, but I suppose the widow may stay if she wishes. She was always fond of lingering where she was not needed." A ripple of quiet laughter moved through the room. Eleanor said nothing. She had learned long ago that silence was the only armor these people could not pierce. Master Corwin set his wooden box upon the great table at the front of the room and unlocked it with a small brass key. From within he drew a thick sheaf of documents, and the room fell silent as a tomb. He cleared his throat, adjusted his spectacles, and began to read. The first portions were exactly as expected. The crown lands and the state treasury passed to the throne as the law required. There were bequests to loyal servants, pensions for the household, gifts to the various churches and charities the old king had supported. Corwin read through them steadily, and with each passing clause Margaret's satisfaction visibly grew, for she knew that the great matter, the private fortune, the estates, Rosewood itself, was always saved for last. At length Corwin reached it. He paused and looked up, and for just a moment his old eyes moved across the room and came to rest on the woman standing in the shadows by the shelves. Then he looked down again and continued to read. "And now," he read, "I come to the disposition of my private estate, that wealth which is mine alone to give, untouched by crown or law. I have thought long upon this matter, longer than any of those who expect to benefit from it could imagine. And I have made my decision not according to blood, nor according to expectation, but according to the truth of the human heart, which I have learned to read only late in my long life." The room had gone very still. Margaret sat forward slightly, her chin lifted. "There is among my family," Corwin read on, "one person who came to me a stranger and became, in my final years, the truest companion I have known. One person who asked nothing of me and gave everything. One person whom this court has scorned and slighted and thought unworthy, while she alone showed me the meaning of loyalty." Corwin stopped. He reached into the box once more, and this time he drew out a separate letter, sealed with the king's private wax, the color of old blood. He held it up so that all could see the unbroken seal. "The king left instructions," Corwin said quietly, "that at this point in the reading this letter be opened and read aloud. It is written in his own hand. He wished there to be no doubt." And in the silence of that great library, with the rain still streaking down the tall windows, and every eye now turning slowly, disbelievingly, toward the woman standing forgotten in the shadows, Master Corwin broke the seal of the dead king's most private letter, and began to read the name that would change everything. Master Corwin unfolded the letter with the care of a man handling something sacred. The paper crackled softly in the silence. He drew a breath, and when he spoke, it was the old king's voice that filled the room, reaching out from beyond the grave through the words he had left behind. "To all who are gathered to hear my final wishes," Corwin read, "and most especially to those who believe they already know what those wishes must be, I ask you now to listen, and to listen well, for a dead man cannot repeat himself." Margareth's smile had frozen upon her face. It had not yet fallen, but it no longer belonged there, and she seemed unaware of how strange it looked, fixed and rigid, as the words began to turn against her. "For many years," the letter went on, "I permitted a great injustice to unfold beneath my own roof, and I did nothing to stop it. When my son Edmund brought Eleanor into this house, I saw at once that she was good. I saw it, and I said nothing, because it was easier to let the court have its way than to defend a young woman who had not yet learned to defend herself. That silence is the shame I carry to my grave. I watched them slight her for 20 years, and I told myself it was not my concern. I was a coward in this, as kings are often cowards in the things that matter most." A murmur passed through the room. Several of the assembled relations shifted in their chairs and stole glances at one another. Eleanor, still standing against the shelves, had gone very pale. Her hand had risen to rest against her collarbone, and her eyes were fixed on the notary as though she could not quite believe the voice she was hearing. "But in the years after my son's death," the letter continued, "when I was old and frightened and alone, it was not my sister who sat with me. It was not my nephews who visited only when they wished to remind me of their existence. It was not any of the great and noble persons who now no doubt fill this room in their fine mourning clothes. It was Eleanor, the physician's daughter, the woman you all thought beneath us. She came to me in my loneliness and asked for nothing, and she gave me back some measure of the peace I thought I had lost forever when Edmund died." Margareth's frozen smile finally collapsed. In its place came something harder, a tightening of the jaw, a narrowing of the eyes. She turned her head slowly and looked at Eleanor across the room, and the look was pure venom. "I have watched her," the king's letter said, "when she did not know I was watching. I have seen her show kindness to servants who could do nothing for her. I have seen her defend those weaker than herself. I have seen her endure cruelty with a dignity that I, a king, could never have matched. And I have asked myself a question that I could no longer avoid. To whom should a man leave the things he loves? To those who share his blood but not his heart? Or to the one soul who proved, day after day, year after year, that she understood what loyalty and love truly mean?" Corwin paused and turned the page. No one in the room made a sound. Even the fire seemed to hold its breath. "And so I have made my decision," he read, "and I make it freely in sound mind, and I will brook no argument from the grave. My entire private fortune, my estates, my investments, my collections, my jewels, and above all my beloved Rosewood, the house where I was happiest, I leave, wholly and without condition, to my daughter-in-law Eleanor." The room erupted. It was not a loud eruption at first. These were nobles, after all, trained from birth to swallow their reactions. But it was an eruption nonetheless. A sudden violent rustle of whispers and indrawn breaths, and the scrape of a chair as someone half rose in disbelief. Margareth came to her feet in a single sharp motion, her black skirt snapping. "This is absurd," she said, her voice cutting across the room. "This is the raving of a sick old man, manipulated in his final days by a scheming woman. That letter proves nothing except that she worked her way into his confusion. I will not stand for it. I will not." Master Corwin looked at her over his spectacles with an expression of infinite patience. "The letter is written in the king's own hand, my lady," he said. "It is witnessed. It is dated. It was composed more than 2 years ago, at a time when His Majesty's mind was, by the account of every physician who attended him, entirely sound. It is not the product of any final confusion. He knew precisely what he was doing, and he anticipated precisely this objection." Corwin glanced down at the letter again. "In fact, he addresses it directly. Shall I read on?" Margaret said nothing. Her hands had curled into fists at her sides. "I know what my sister will say," Corwin read, and at these words a fresh silence fell, for the dead king had reached forward across time and named her thought before she could speak it. "She will say that Eleanor manipulated me. She will say that I was old and weak and easily led. Margaret, I have known you all my life, and I know the shape of your objections before you make them. So let me answer you plainly, one last time. You call Eleanor a schemer because you cannot imagine a person who does not scheme. You accuse her of manipulation because manipulation is the only language you have ever spoken. You look at her kindness and you see a trick, because you have never in your life performed a kindness that did not have a price. The fault is not in her. It is in you. It has always been in you." Someone in the back of the room drew a sharp, audible breath. Margaret stood frozen, and for the first time in perhaps her entire life, she appeared to have no words at all. The color had drained from her face and then flooded back into it, blotched and red. "I do not write this to wound you," the letter continued, more gently now. "I write it because it is true, and because a dying man owes the living the truth, however late. There is still time for you, sister. Eleanor holds no malice toward you, though God knows you have given her cause. If you go to her honestly, you may find in her a friend where you have insisted on seeing an enemy. But the fortune is hers. On that there is no argument to be had." Corwin lowered the letter. "That," he said, "is the substance of it. There are legal instruments accompanying this letter, all properly executed and witnessed, which give it the full force of law. The transfer of the private estate to Lady Eleanor is complete and binding. It cannot be contested. His Majesty was very thorough." For a long moment no one moved. Then, slowly, every head in the room turned toward the woman standing against the bookshelves. The woman they had not bothered to give a chair. The woman Margaret had mocked not 1 hour before. The woman who was now, by the will of the dead king, one of the wealthiest people in the kingdom of Alderneth. Eleanor had not moved at all. She stood exactly where she had stood, one hand still pressed to her collarbone, and down her pale cheeks ran 2 silent lines of tears. But they were not tears of triumph. Anyone watching closely, and they were all watching now, would have seen that she was not looking at Margaret, nor at the stunned faces of the court, nor at the notary with his life-changing documents. She was looking at nothing at all, at some point far beyond the walls of that room, and her lips moved once, silently, forming a single word that only she could hear. "Alaric." She was not thinking of the fortune. In that moment she did not care about the estates or the jewels or the beloved house called Rosewood. She was thinking of an old man by a fire on long winter evenings, a lonely king who had told her his stories and laughed at her small jokes, and without her ever knowing it, had been watching her all along. She had given him her friendship freely, expecting nothing, wanting nothing, and he had seen her. After 22 years of being invisible in that palace, one person had truly seen her, and he had loved her enough to say so to the whole world, when he was no longer even alive to face the consequences. It was Margaret who broke the silence, and her voice, when it came, was low and shaking with fury. "You think this is over," she said, staring at Eleanor. "You think a letter settles it. There are ways to challenge such things. There are questions to be asked about how an old man's affections were secured. I promise you, physician's daughter, this is not finished." Eleanor lifted her eyes at last and looked at the older woman. And when she finally spoke, her voice was soft, but it carried to every corner of that silent room. "He said you would say that too," she replied. The words landed like a blow. Margaret recoiled as though struck, and a low murmur, was it possible? Was it almost a suppressed laugh? Rippled through the assembled nobles who a moment ago had all been firmly on the Countess's side. The wind, everyone in that room suddenly understood, had changed direction, and Margaret understood it most sharply of all. She gathered her skirts, lifted her chin in a last ruined attempt at dignity, and swept from the library without another word, the great doors booming shut behind her. But the story of Rosewood was far from over. For in claiming her inheritance, Eleanor was about to discover that the old king had left her more than a fortune. Hidden within the walls of the house he loved, sealed away for reasons no one yet understood, was a secret that would test everything she believed about the family that had scorned her, and about the quiet, watchful king who had seen her true. Rosewood stood at the end of a long avenue of ancient oaks, a warm, honey-colored house wrapped in ivy, and the first time Eleanor walked through its doors as its owner, she felt like a trespasser in a dream. The staff had lined up to greet her in the great hall, and to her surprise their faces held no resentment, only a kind of cautious warmth. They had known the old king here, away from the cold performances of the court, and they had known what he thought of the woman his court despised. Word of the letter had reached them before she had. They welcomed her not as an intruder, but as the person their master had chosen. For the first week she simply lived in it. She walked the gardens the old king had described to her on those long winter evenings, and found them exactly as he had said. She sat in the library where he had told her he read his favorite books as a boy. She began slowly to understand that this house had not been left to her as a reward or a possession. It had been left as a message. "This is where I was happiest. I wanted you to have the place I loved most." It was the most personal gift one human being could give another, and it had come from a man everyone had assumed she was only using. But the old king, it seemed, was not yet finished with her. It was in his private study, some 6 weeks after she took possession, that Eleanor found the second letter. She had been going through his desk, a task she had put off, because it felt like an intrusion even now, when she discovered that one of the drawers did not run as deep as the others. Behind a panel of dark wood, cleverly fitted, was a hidden compartment, and inside it lay a bundle of papers tied with faded ribbon, and a letter on top addressed, in the king's familiar hand, to her. Her hands trembled as she opened it. "Dear Eleanor," it began, "if you are reading this, then you have made Rosewood your own, and you have begun to poke about in an old man's private things, which means you are exactly the person I believed you to be. I have one last confession and one last request, and then I will trouble you no more." She sat down slowly in the old leather chair. "The papers beneath this letter concern my sister Margaret," the king wrote. "Many years ago, before you ever came to us, she did a terrible thing. In her hunger for position, she ruined a good man, a court official named Hallow, who had discovered that she was diverting funds from the royal charities into her own accounts. Rather than be exposed, she destroyed him. She spread lies about his honesty, engineered his dismissal, and drove his family into poverty. He died a broken man, and his name was never cleared. I knew the truth. I had the proof. And I did nothing because she was my sister and because it was easier. That is the second great cowardice of my life. The first was failing to protect you." Eleanor lifted her eyes from the page. Outside the window, the oaks moved in the wind. "I could have exposed her at any time," the letter continued. "I chose not to, and I will answer for that choice wherever I am now. But I could not carry the proof into the grave and let it die with me, for that would make Hallow's ruin complete and permanent. So I leave the evidence to you, Eleanor, every document, every account, every witness statement I gathered in secret over the years. I leave it to you because you are the only person I have ever known who would use such a weapon justly. In your hands I trust it, in anyone else's I do not." The final lines were written in a shakier hand, as though set down much later than the rest. What you do with this is yours to decide. You may expose her and clear the name of an innocent man and his descendants who live yet in poverty in the town of Greywater, or you may burn these papers and let the past stay buried. I will not tell you which is right, because I no longer trust my own judgment in these matters. I have chosen silence too many times and called it peace. I ask only that you choose better than I did. You always have. That is why I chose you. Alaric. Eleanor sat for a long time in the fading light, the papers heavy in her lap. She understood now the true shape of what the old king had done. He had not merely made her rich. He had handed her the one thing that could destroy the woman who had tormented her for 22 years, and he had left the choice entirely in her hands. It was, she realized, the ultimate test of everything he had believed about her. Margaret had called her a schemer, had promised that the fight was not finished, had swept from the library vowing vengeance. And here, in Eleanor's lap, lay the means to end Margaret completely, to ruin her as she had ruined Hallow, to pay back 22 years of cold cruelty with one clean, devastating stroke. No one would blame her. That was the terrible thing. Everyone would understand. Eleanor read the papers through, all of them, over the course of that long evening. The evidence was overwhelming and precise. Margaret's guilt was beyond any doubt. And in the town of Greywater, the letter said, the family of the ruined man still lived grandchildren who had grown up under the shadow of a lie, who had inherited poverty and shame for a crime their grandfather never committed. In the end, it was not a difficult choice, though it was not the choice her enemies would have made. Eleanor did not go to Margaret. She did not confront her, did not threaten her, did not savor the older woman's fear. Instead, she traveled quietly to Greywater. She found the descendants of the man called Hallow living in a small, clean, poor house at the edge of the town, and she sat with them at their humble table, and she showed them the proof that their grandfather had been an honest man destroyed by a powerful woman's lie. She watched an elderly granddaughter, a woman near her own age, who had grown up hearing her family name spoken as a curse, press the old documents to her chest and weep with a relief that had waited a lifetime to arrive. Eleanor used a portion of the old king's fortune to restore what had been taken from them, to buy back the small property their grandfather had lost, to settle a sum upon the family that would end their poverty for good, and to see the record formally corrected so that the name of Hallow was cleared in every register where it had been stained. She did it without fanfare and without any public accusation against Margaret at all. She did not need to destroy the Countess to right the wrong. She only needed to tell the truth to the people who had waited longest to hear it. But truth, once spoken, has a way of traveling. Word of what Eleanor had done spread through the kingdom in the quiet way that important things spread, first among the household staff, then among the lesser nobles, then at last into the great houses of the court. And with it, inevitably, spread the reason, the old buried crime that had ruined an honest man, and the name of the woman who had committed it. Margaret was never formally charged. Eleanor never lifted a finger against her, but the Countess found, in the months that followed, that the doors of the court had grown strangely cold to her. Invitations ceased to arrive. Conversations fell silent when she entered a room. The very weapons she had used against Eleanor for 22 years were turned upon her now, not by any plot, but simply by the truth becoming known. She had built her whole life upon the good opinion of people who now could not quite meet her eyes. In the end, she withdrew from court altogether and retired to a distant estate, where she lived out her remaining years in the one thing she had always most feared, to be forgotten. Eleanor, for her part, did not gloat, and did not celebrate, and did not speak of Margaret at all. She had not acted out of revenge. She had acted as she had always acted, out of a simple refusal to let a lie stand when she had the power to set it right. It was exactly why the old king had chosen her. He had known that the woman his court called a schemer was the one person in the whole kingdom who would use a weapon of destruction only to heal. She lived many years at Rosewood after that. She opened its gardens to the people of the surrounding villages. She used the old king's fortune to build schools and to fund the work her own father had done long ago, sending physicians into towns too poor to afford them. The physician's daughter, whom the court had thought unworthy to sit among them, became in time the most beloved figure in the kingdom of Alderneth, not because of the fortune she had inherited, but because of what she chose to do with it. And on winter evenings, when the fire burned low and the wind moved through the great oaks outside, she would sometimes sit alone in the old king's study, and she would look at the empty chair across from her, and she would speak a few soft words aloud, as though the old man might still be listening from wherever he had gone. She had come to that palace a stranger, and they had spent 20 years pretending not to see her. But one person had seen her true, and in the end, that had changed everything. Because the world is full of people who will judge you by where you came from, and mock what you cannot help, and leave you standing in the shadows without a chair. But every so often, if you keep your heart honest when it would be easier to let it harden, someone sees you. And when they do, the whole cold weight of all that scorn is answered in a single moment, not with revenge, but with a truth that can never again be taken away. That was the inheritance the old king truly left her. Not the gold, not the house, but the proof, written in his own hand for all the world to read, that a quiet, faithful heart is worth more than all the noble blood in any kingdom. And that is a fortune no one can ever take from you.